Good morning. Now, I assume that there are some of us here who decided to commit to some New Year resolutions at the beginning of the year. A friend of ours was considering this, and he found and sent us this. Somebody asked me about my New Year's resolution. This year, I want to be more like Jesus. To hang out with sinners, upset religious people, tell stories that make people think, choose unpopular friends, be kind, loving and merciful, take naps on boats. Do you recognise Jesus in that list? Yeah. Sounds like Jesus, doesn't it? So Jesus is recognisable. The aroma of Christ is distinct. So you'd think that as we continue our journey through the book of Luke, reflecting on the life of Jesus and exploring how that life can shape our lives, you'd think that identifying and imitating Christ should be quite straightforward because Jesus is recognisable. And we just sang about Jesus being God revealed to us, that God wants to reveal to us. So you'd think it'd be all straightforward. You'd think that we'd be able to know if I'm heading in this direction, that's away from Christ. Oh, thank you. And if I head in that direction, I'm more like Christ. You'd think it should be quite straightforward. But actually, it's the opposite. It is really messy because there are many conflicting views on what Jesus stood for and many conflicting views about what being a true follower of Jesus looks like. Let me give you one very recent example of that. Do you remember this from January? So the day after President Trump was inaugurated, he attended a national prayer service, which happened that time to be held at the Episcopal Church in Washington. And so the bishop, Reverend Buddy, spoke at that national prayer service with President Trump present. She only spoke for 2 minutes. Towards the end of what she had to say, she said, "I am a person of faith," and then proceeded to describe how being a follower of Jesus should therefore be reflected in our values and priorities, and asking President Trump to be mindful of Christ and Christ's example in the choices he was going to make. She only spoke for 2 minutes. How do you remember it went down? Not well at all. Afterwards, the President condemned Reverend Buddy as being nasty and what she had to say, a disgraceful attack from the radical left disguised as faith. And then he described her as a phony Christian. So what did she say that was so bad? What did she say that was so unlike Christ? Well, this is part of what she said. First of all, as I said, she declared, "I am a person of faith." Let me make one final plea, Mr. President. Millions have put their trust in you. As you told the nation yesterday at your inauguration, you have felt the providential hand of a loving God because he believes his life was saved in that assassination attempt by God. In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. Our God teaches us that we are to be merciful to the stranger, for we were once strangers in this land. May God grant us all the strength and courage to honour the dignity of every human being, speak the truth in love, and walk humbly with one another and our God. Now, I have a dilemma because I recognise Jesus in those words and the kingdom that Jesus has asked us to seek first. I recognise that kingdom in her words. Does anybody else recognise Jesus and the kingdom in those words? So does that make us phony Christians? Well, as you can imagine, there was an international uproar ignited by this whole event, and a lot of responses, a whole range of responses, from the president of our own Uniting Church National Assembly, sending a very strong letter of support to Reverend Buddy, on the one hand, to comments about Reverend Buddy that she was a witch and calling her a God hater. And everyone in those views all proclaiming that they were speaking in God's name. It is messy, isn't it? How can we shape our lives on Jesus if there are so many conflicting views on what Jesus stands for and what it means to be a true follower of Christ? So one writer who really helped me in navigating this disturbing mess wrote this last month. This is not about who we like better or align with politically. It's not about choosing Team Buddy or Team Trump. It is about two competing versions of the Christian faith. It's not about left and right, but what it really means to be faithful to Jesus. And then he goes on. That's Shane Claiborne. The word Christian means Christ-like. If it doesn't look like Jesus and it doesn't sound like Jesus, let's not call it Christianity. If it's not about love and mercy, let's not call it Christianity. If it's not good news to the poor, let's not call it Christianity. If it's not about welcoming the stranger, let's not call it Christianity. I wonder if we can hold that front of mind as we now continue our journey through Luke, trying to explore who is this Jesus and what does it mean to be a true follower. As Greg said, we're up to Luke chapter 8. And just as Mark pointed out last week, Luke really enjoys comparing and contrasting, putting two very different stories side by side to teach us a bit more about what it means to be a Christ follower. And we're going to see two very, very different people. The only thing that unites them is the same thing that united the two people from last week. Do you remember? The two people were united by the fact that they were desperate for Jesus to intervene. And it's desperation, that's the one thing these two people have got in common. So we're going to be looking at two case studies of two people who encounter Jesus. So we read from verse 40. Now when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. So our first case study of someone encountering Jesus in a state of desperation is Jairus, a synagogue leader. So I did some research into who and what is a synagogue leader. And whereas high priest looked after the temple, synagogue leaders were elected by their local community to manage the local synagogue. And they had these sort of functions. The last one's really interesting. Warn about any heresy or false teacher. Jairus would have known that Jesus had only a couple of chapters earlier been kicked out of a temple, for his teaching. So Jairus would have known that Jesus was already on the watch list for heresy. Knowing all that, knowing that Jairus was a highly visible and respected man in his community, in fact, he was charged as like the guardian of the faith. That's how seriously people took that synagogue leader role. So knowing all that, what he represented, look at the risks Jairus took. He comes to Jesus in daylight, not like, remember Nicodemus who used the cover of night? Comes in daylight to a very public place. He would have been highly recognisable, and humbles himself falling at Jesus' feet. He was willing to sacrifice everything because he was so desperate. Have you ever been that desperate? Can you relate to that sort of desperation? So what does Jesus do? How does Jesus respond to this raw desperation? The next verse says, as Jesus was on his way. Jesus says, yes, I'll go with you. So they're on their way and the crowd's almost crushing him. And now we're introduced to the second person in this story, the second case study. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. This story is actually in 3 of the Gospels, and there's some more details given if you look at Mark's Gospel about this woman. Some really interesting added details are provided. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, we read in Mark's Gospel. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. Can you feel for her? When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Just like Jairus, this woman who's not named, this woman takes enormous risks to get close to Jesus because of her desperation. So if you think about her medical condition, so here's this woman who for 12 years has been bleeding. So it's some sort of hemorrhage or menstrual discharge. And because of that, she is deemed ceremonially unclean the whole time, which means she's barred from all public places and spaces like the synagogue. She cannot worship with others because she's seen as unclean. So just imagine, it's like through COVID, when we had to practice that social distancing, 12 years of extreme social distancing this woman experiences. And if you do some more research, you'll find that there were multiple layers of consequences for her, because when you're bleeding, you're not allowed to have anyone share your bed. So we don't know whether she was already married. Did the marriage survive? She cannot have children, perhaps, or she cannot touch her own children. All the consequences for this woman. And what we see is that rather than her being passive, she was really proactive. She went from one doctor to another looking for answers. She spent everything she had trying to look for answers. So not passive, a proactive person. But instead of getting better, she was getting worse. I really feel for this woman. And what really strikes me is that whereas I reckon, I don't know by what year I would have become a twisted, bitter person, she's still hopeful. She's still got faith. She still goes running after Jesus. Major costs for her, though, in going to Jesus, because everyone that she, in her state of ceremonial uncleanness, everyone that she touches now becomes unclean. And they now have to go through some sort of purifying ritual. So you can just imagine people would not want to be touched by her. So she enters this space of crushing crowds and wants to touch Jesus. Lots of risks, You can just imagine, she knows the consequences. If she's discovered in that crowd, the crowd could turn on her. And if the crowd realises that she's actually going to touch Jesus, or has touched Jesus, making him ceremonially unclean, you can imagine how the crowd would turn on her. Again, desperation making her take incredible risks. So, she comes up behind him, she touches Jesus, knowing all these consequences and all these risks, and she touches the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. She's healed. She's healed. What Jesus does next has major consequences for both her and for Jairus. Jesus takes a particular action next. Rather than letting this woman just slip back into the crowd, instead what Jesus does is he draws attention. He stops, and he says, "Who touched me?" When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." You can just imagine Peter thinking, "You've got to be kidding, Jesus. Who has not touched you? Look at the crowd. Everyone would have touched you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone from me." Can you picture Jairus at this moment? Right, before he thought, when Jesus responded to his plea, he thought, okay, the ambulance has responded and we're moving towards my dying daughter through really, really heavy traffic, but the ambulance is moving. At this moment, the ambulance has stopped. Can you identify with Jairus at this moment? What he would be thinking? Jesus has stopped. The ambulance has stopped. Has Jesus forgotten my daughter? Can you imagine how this woman would be feeling at this moment? For just a moment, she's experiencing this exquisite bliss of, I've been healed. The bleeding has stopped. And the very next moment, intense panic, oh no, I've been uncovered, I've been disclosed, the crowd is now going to turn on me. Why would Jesus put her at such risk? The thing I love about these stories is that Jesus is not just interested in physically healing this woman. Jesus is really about holistic care. He knew that this woman was virtually a social leper. And by drawing attention to her and getting her to tell her story, he reinstates her. So look at the next part. Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, that's key, in the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." It appears that's the only time Jesus ever called a woman daughter in the Gospels. Isn't it significant? This woman who probably has been barred from all the joys of family, of community. She couldn't even eat with others. He calls her daughter. And he affirms her faith in front of all the crowds. So rather than this woman being secretly healed, and who would have believed it? I mean, menstrual discharge is a very private condition. Who would have been able to believe it? In front of everyone, Jesus says, "You have been healed." So he reinstates her. He gives her a community when she didn't have a community. Someone who was unclean, he now says she is clean. So he was far more interested in just her physical healing. He healed her socially, emotionally. She's now allowed to go to places of worship. He's healed her on so many levels. Go in peace. Such a good news story, for her, but what about Jairus? We read on. While Jesus was still speaking to her, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," he said. "Don't bother the teacher anymore." Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just believe, and she will be healed." Don't be afraid, just believe. Have you ever been in a horrible, tragic, crushing experience in your life, and somehow in the midst of all that you heard the Spirit whisper to you, "Don't be afraid, just believe"? Because I think the Spirit is coming to us all the time with those words. So what did Jairus do? I guess the only thing any of us can do at those times. Follow Jesus. Just keep following Jesus. That's what he does. So when Jesus had arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John and James, and the child's parents, Jairus and the mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. "Stop wailing," Jesus said. "She is not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But he took her by the hand and said, "My child, get up." Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened. You know, I reflected on that part. I mean, here's this death to life event. You can't get bigger than that. And as soon as that happens, Jesus tells the parents to do what seems like this incredibly domestically trivial, insignificant thing: give her something to eat. And I thought, why would Jesus do that? And then I thought, again, the beauty of the holistic care that Jesus offers. Jesus knew that these parents would have thought, "Oh, how do we relate to her now? Is she some sort of weird spirit, body? Has she come from the other side?" They would have wondered, how do we relate to her now? So Jesus gives them a really simple task to do. Prepare food, feed her, watch her eat. See, she's still the little girl you always had. And he resets the narrative to see this is normal, you can proceed. The kindness of Jesus in that moment is really quite overwhelming. So here we've got two wonderful stories of people who encounter Jesus. And we learn so much about Jesus from these stories, don't we? We learn that Jesus responds to pleas of desperation, regardless of your position or your power. We see in these stories that Jesus had incredible compassion, attending to not just the big things, but even the small things. We see Jesus was really interested in holistic care. We see that Jesus was interruptible. That woman interrupted him. That's good to remember. Sometimes when we're praying, we think, "Oh, I'm going to interrupt God." Jesus was interruptible. There's so much about Jesus we can see in these stories. And of course, then how do we shape and be shaped by what we've learned? And my prayer is that the Spirit has been whispering to every one of us as we've been listening to this story about how we can be shaped more. But I want to finish in these last few minutes just looking at how we can be misshapen by some of the stories of Jesus. Again, by sharing a very current and very dramatic story. You might have remembered reading about this over the last few months, but particularly last month. 14 members of an Australian religious group are convicted over diabetic girls' death. Do you remember reading about this recently? All right, so it's a group in Toowoomba, a religious group in Toowoomba who called themselves the Saints. 2 bereaved parents and 12 fellow members of an Australian religious congregation accused of killing an 8-year-old girl by withholding her diabetes medication have been found guilty of her manslaughter. It goes on. In footage released by the Supreme Court following the verdict of manslaughter, the mother told detectives they took Elizabeth off her medication and, quote, waited for God to do his work. She said, "We still believe he can do anything and he has promised healing." I've been reflecting on these people, trying to look through a lens of empathy to them. And I'm thinking, okay, let's say they came across this passage from Luke that we just studied. Okay, you can imagine them saying, okay, we read here, Jesus saying, your faith has healed you. So we have to put our faith in faith, not put our faith in science. Let's take her off the insulin and put our faith in God instead. And you can imagine them all encouraging each other. Do we have faith? Do we believe? Do we believe that Jesus is the same yesterday, today and forever? So Jesus told us, your faith has healed you, so our faith will heal her. And you can imagine that over the next few days, as Elizabeth was really failing and weakening, them again really exhorting each other with these words from Luke we read. Don't be afraid. It looks like she's failing, but look at her with eyes of faith. Just believe she will be healed. You can imagine them all encouraging each other, even saying, remember, it's our faith that's going to heal her. Don't you be the weak link. Do you believe? Do you believe enough? Come on, we've all got to believe enough. See the danger there? The faith in our faith starts to happen rather than faith in Jesus. And then she died, Elizabeth died. And in the police reports it says that the parents of the group did not alert the police about Elizabeth's death until the next day. So you can imagine this group, she's died. But in this book, the book of Luke, they would say to each other, Jesus said she's not dead, she's asleep. You can just imagine them exhorting each other saying, she's not dead, she's asleep, she's asleep. These people would have thought they were true believers. They would have thought that these stories of Jesus were shaping their values, their priorities, their behaviour, that they were doing the right thing, and that maybe the rest of us were, I don't know, phony Christians, I don't know. Can you see the danger here? And what I'm thinking is that through all this, the Spirit would have been saying, the miracle is in the insulin. Put her back on the medication. The miracle is the insulin. Those stories break our hearts, but they show us how dangerous it can be, how we can be misshapen by some of these stories. So I'm going to ask 2 questions, and if you don't feel comfortable putting your hand up in response, please don't. It's only if you feel comfortable. The 2 questions are, who here has either themselves or in someone you know really closely has known that a miracle of healing has happened? It cannot be explained in any other way, that they have either in themselves or in someone they know, you know there's been a miracle of healing. Can you put your hand up? Okay, you might want to look around, quite a few people. Greg and I talked about this before. We've both got our hands up, but we're thinking about the same person. There's only one person we know of. All right? Second question, if you feel comfortable. Who here has pleaded with God at some time for healing for yourself or for somebody else, and the healing did not come? Okay, lots and lots of people. What do we do with that? it would appear that sometimes God heals, most of the time God doesn't. What do we do with that? Especially, Jesus is the same yesterday, today and forever. What do we do with that? Well, people like Paul realised that it's not always going to happen. While I was preparing this message over the last few weeks, I realised something. I realised that 2025 is the 50th anniversary of me coming to Jesus and becoming a Jesus follower. So for half a century, I've been now studying the life of Jesus and seeking to be an image bearer. And I thought, what have I learned in these 50 years? One thing I've definitely learned is that I have less certainty and more mystery. There is much less that I know now than I claimed to know 50 years ago. I thought I'd worked it all out 50 years ago. I'm certain about the goodness of God, but I find disturbing mystery, frustrating mystery about how God chooses to express that goodness. I've also learned how dangerous it is when I read the Bible as a code book. And that if I'm holy enough, I'll crack the God code and find the formula that will give me all the answers to my prayers. I'll just be able to pray and get what I want if I can just crack the God code. Instead, what I've found over the last 50 years is that the Bible is not a code book. It's actually helpful for me to read it more as a case book, full of case studies of people encountering Jesus, encountering God, and God encountering them. That it's not about finding a faith formula, it's about responding to a daily invitation from Jesus to follow me, follow me. And I've also learned in the 50 years that I don't think that God has promised healing. What I believe God has promised is to be with us no matter what we go through. Emmanuel, God with us. That's the promise. That no matter what you go through, and remember Jesus actually told us, in this world you will have many troubles. But I'm with you. The promise is God is with us. So how do we shape our lives? We shape our lives knowing that we're called, we're invited to follow, stay close. God is with us. No promise of healing, but promise of witness. God is with us.